Good evening. As we are in the middle of the Sacratridium, I want to talk to you about the 3 worst days in the history of the world, starting with the most recent. The first of these days is most personal to you. Tonight I'm asking you to think about the worst day of your life for just a moment. The worst time of your life. The day when you may have hit rock bottom with something. The most difficult and challenging time of your life. Maybe someone did something awful to you. Or maybe the worst sin you ever committed. Or maybe the day that you committed a sin that you still can't kick. The day in your life when you were racked with paralyzing fear and overcome with hopelessness. Maybe that's an actual single day in your life. Maybe it's a period of days. Maybe it's a season of life. Maybe you're in it right now. We'll call that your personal Good Friday. Which brings us to the next day. The actual worst day in the history of human existence. The first Good Friday, 2,000 years ago. Now, in the Passion narrative we just heard from the Gospel of John, he doesn't give us much detail of the crucifixion itself. He even puts it in the past tense. He says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus. But the reality is far different for those that died from this horrible form of capital punishment, including, and perhaps especially, Jesus. You see, crucifixion, which is derived from the word excrucia, or excruciating, was a terrible way to die. It killed people in 2 ways. First, they slowly bled to death. And second, because there was no way for people who were hanging on the cross to support their own weight, they would actually asphyxiate. The victims couldn't breathe, and so every time they tried to breathe, it would be excruciating. It would normally take many hours, if not a day or 2, for the victims to die. Which is why Pilate was so surprised when he heard that Jesus died after 6 hours. 6 hours! Can you imagine being in pain like that for 6 hours? I don't know about you, but I get a paper cut, and in 10 seconds, I'm running to the medicine cabinet for a Band-Aid. 10 minutes of a migraine, and I'm trying to find the Advil. Only 6 hours? Because he already endured so much sleep deprivation, starvation, torture, even before the cross. He couldn't withstand much more. For the Romans, crucifixion wasn't only a horrible physical way to die, it was also humiliating. One aspect of our Western modern sensibilities is that when we see Christ depicted on the cross, usually he has some sort of cloth around his waist. Oh no. No, mostly for the Romans, everyone who was crucified naked. For all to see them out in a public area, on the cross, struggling for every breath, all the while being mocked, spat upon, rocks thrown. And for Jesus, his mother, Mary, watching all of this close by. The Romans, they loved this. They loved this. Now for us, in this country, for the most part, we're different. Right? Like for example, in our country, dating back to 1791, when the 8th Amendment for the Constitution was ratified, is where we first find the words, no cruel or unusual punishment becoming the law of the land. But for the Romans, oh no, they went the opposite way. They wanted cruel punishment to be the usual. Call it a deterrent, call it bloodlust. That was their standard operating procedure. But for Jesus, these still weren't the only reasons why this was his worst day. This is the day that Jesus had to surrender his public ministry. His life's work of teaching, healing, evangelizing along with his closest friends who, by the way, had all abandoned him. Jesus had to endure Judas. Judas was part of his inner circle. He had broken bread with him time and again. And Judas ratted him out for 30 pieces of silver. Judas, all the time with Jesus, and his heart was still as stony and as sinful as those two common thieves that hung upon the cross next to Christ. And Peter, where was Peter now? Peter, who Jesus called first on the shore. Peter, who looked into Jesus' eyes that night on the boat in the storm when he walked on the water. Peter, who saw Christ transfigured on the mountain. Peter, who Christ proclaimed he would give the keys to the kingdom of heaven to. Peter, who had abandoned and denied Jesus not once but 3 times. Where was he now? No doubt, this was his worst day for all of those reasons. Which brings us to our third worst day. For this day, we have to go back, way back to the very beginning, to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Before Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden, they had it all. They had paradise, and God had given them dominion over all of his magnificent creation. And maybe, even more importantly, they had a beautiful, personal relationship with God himself. But pride and temptation got the best of them. And after original sin takes place, God comes calling for them. But they are nowhere to be found. They have evaded God. And Adam's first words to God are not full of joy and gratitude for giving him everything. When God finds Adam, he says to him, "I heard you, God, but I hid from you because I was afraid." This truly is the first worst day, because with this sin comes 2 things: our separation from God and the birthplace of fear. And today, when we commemorate Jesus' worst day ever, and when we look up at the cross, we are confronted with our own fears. We see everything that fear gives us. Everything from that original sin. We see the fear of pain, fear of humiliation, fear of being falsely accused, fear of losing everything we've ever worked for, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, and of course, fear of death. And Jesus takes all of that. He takes all of that fear, coupled with all of our sin, and he absorbs it, and he pays the price for all of us. He dies for all of us. He dies and he takes our worst days with him. In the greatest expression of sacrifice and love the universe has ever or will ever see. And while today may be Jesus' worst day, it's not his last day. Not his last day by a long shot. This worst day, this Good Friday, leads to the most triumphant day ever in just 3 days' time, when he will rise and gather those principalities of evil, of sin, of fear, gather them around and parade them for all of us to see that he conquered them, to bring redemption to Adam and Eve. Just like a king in those days, after a victorious battle, would gather them, all the conquered people, and bring them back home and parade them in the town square for all the people to see. Now, in just a few minutes, we will have a chance to venerate the cross, a Good Friday custom that dates back all the way to the 4th century. We pay tribute, we express our love and gratitude to Christ for his ultimate sacrifice. Now, maybe this year, if I can be so bold as to suggest that we add one small element to this 1,600-year-old tradition. That we take the memory and the baggage of our worst days. We take the remnants of the worst times of our lives. We summons our worst fears. And when we walk up to the cross on this Good Friday, we surrender them. We unload them. We leave them at the foot of the cross once and for all, because that is the very thing Christ is inviting us to do, and exactly why he endured the cross for all of us. And out of love, handed over his Spirit.